to another episode of Analyzing the Apocalypse. We are continuing in our discussion about the background of Revelation, and we're pivoting from where we were in our first episode talking about how to approach the book, and now actually just talking about the background details that tell us a lot about the book that are important before we really dive into the text. So first and foremost, we need to recognize that Revelation, in its unusual imagery, has a very storied background. Toward the end of the first century, we see the Roman government zeroing in on Christianity as a threat. And you might wonder why that is. In the ancient world, and just speaking in general about the ancient world, not just even the Roman government here, but the ancient world looked at things a little bit differently than you and I might look at them. They would see things in the sense that Christianity was preaching a different king. And that's certainly true. We preach King Jesus. But that message at the time was quite unpopular, and it was seen as a threat to the security of Rome, and Rome did not take kindly to those types of threats. They viewed that very seriously, and they understood that if another king was around and he could subvert the Roman Caesar, that might cause them to have some issues. So this is the way the Roman government begins to view Christianity toward the end of the first century. So at one time, you see all throughout the book of Acts isolated pockets of persecution coming up. There were times in places like Thessalonica, there were times in places like Asia Minor where persecution crops up, but it's not long lasting, and it seems to be just from town to town. It's not affecting everybody at that point in time, but by the end of the first century, it becomes much more widespread. It starts to take on a different form as the Roman government gets involved and sees Christianity as a very serious problem to their rule. So in this situation, what we begin to see is many Christians who are being put in an impossible situation. They're being forced to decide between Jesus and serving him and bowing down to worship the gods of Rome, which would also include, by the way, the Roman emperor. And so that situation, that choice was thrust upon the early Christians, so they had to make that type of decision. They were compelled to do this, and it was often under the threat of death they were compelled to do this. And many of them, of course, chose death for the sake of Jesus, because they understood that he was worth more to them than whatever the Roman Empire could provide. But just imagine yourself in that situation as you think about this reality that these people faced in the first century. How would you feel in that situation? How would you feel to see a brother or sister be dragged out of their home, compelled to abandon Jesus, to worship the gods of Rome? And you know this person, you have worshiped with this person, they're a great friend of yours, you know that they have now been taken by force, by evil people to do this thing. And you wonder in this situation, where is God? What is he doing? What does this serve? What is this accomplishing? How is this really good? That's a natural question to ask. Again, from our modern perspective, we would say, oh, that's doubt. That's not putting our trust in God. And maybe there's a sense where that's true in some cases. But Revelation does not treat that question as illegitimate. It actually treats it very seriously and seeks to address it. That's why this book was written to begin with, because the background of it is chaotic. It is full of questions that do not have good answers. But Revelation seeks to give those answers. And that's why when we think about the background, it's so important to get these details right, because then we start to see the book for what it really is, and it's no longer as mysterious to us. When we understand that it has a background of persecution, of anxiety, of deep concern, of questions, and the book is seeking to answer these things. So thinking further about the background of the book, let's start with an obvious point. What does the word revelation actually mean? Now you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's kind of obvious, right? It refers to revealing information. And you would be correct. But there's a bit of nuance to the word that I want to make sure we capture so we understand fully what we're talking about when we use the word revelation. It's interesting that in the Greek language, the term that is actually translated revelation is the word we have in English known as apocalypse. So in the Greek language, you have apocalypse being used for revealing information or disclosing truth. Now, you and I would use the word apocalypse, just in general talk and conversation, to describe an end-time event. That maybe a snowstorm is apocalyptic because there's so much ice and there's so much snow accumulation, or there was a tornado and it was an apocalyptic scene, or there was a war and it was an apocalyptic scene. That's how we would use that word in usual conversation. So that's what we think about when we hear it. But the interesting thing is, in the Greek language, that's not really what the context was. That's not what it referred to. It referred to unveiling secrets. It referred to disclosing truth. There was something about this apocalypse that was meant to teach you something, to instruct you in something that you otherwise would not understand. And that right away tells us something very important about the book of Revelation. That in the name itself, we're being taught something. It's meant to inform us. It's not trying to frighten us. Now, certainly there's some frightening imagery in it. I'm not denying that. But I'm simply stating that the book itself, the meaning of that word refers to disclosing truth, informing people about things, not trying to terrify them, not trying to deter them from studying it, but rather to help us to understand. So we might be confused by how Revelation goes about disclosing information, but that does not change the fact that it's trying to teach us something about truth. It's trying to disclose that to us so we can understand it. Now, on that point, still talking about what Revelation is fundamentally, it is a book of prophecy. Now, when I say book of prophecy, let me be clear about what I mean by that. I'm talking about a book that's referring to current events and also future events, and is really using current events to speak about how we should respond to those things, but also talking about events that are future from the perspective of the writer. Keep that in mind. So maybe not future to you and I, but future to the person writing the book. Remember, Revelation was written toward the end of the first century, as we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. So we have to keep that in mind and not think when I say future, I'm talking about from the 21st century perspective, but rather from the first century perspective. But this is what the book is. It's about prophecy. It's revealing information that's going to come to pass. It's going to talk about things that are currently happening, just like we'd find back in the Old Testament. So we've got to be careful about how we read Revelation then and study it, because if we try to read this like it's one of the Gospels, we're not really going to get the intended message. The Gospels are more representative of historical narrative. And that means that when you read through it, you're going to read it in a straightforward way, and you're going to take it, generally speaking, at face value. That doesn't mean there's not nuance in that, where you're going to come across parables, you're going to come across poetry and things like that. But the general cadence of the Gospels is more historical in nature. It's an account of what happened and what was said, and you're going to read it as such. That's not necessarily how Revelation is structured. So even if we were to take the view, like we had talked about last week, of historicism, and we look at it as Revelation unveiling a progression of history, that doesn't really quite capture what the book is doing, because it's not that clean and uniform. And it doesn't need to be, because that's not what it's trying to do. It's not trying to be a straightforward presentation of history. It's trying to communicate deeper truths within the context of history. And that's going to be something we're going to talk about a lot later. So I want to mention this also because it's important that we get this and we understand what we're talking about when we speak of apocalyptic literature. So we just talked about the word apocalypse and what it really means and how Revelation is that. Well, this also becomes a special category of prophecy or literature that is known as the apocalyptic. Now again, that's just a fancy way of talking about books that have a certain type of characterization about them. They use a lot of imagery. They have a lot of interesting things that are said within them, things that are a bit exaggerated. There's a lot of hyperbole and all this going on. And Revelation is not the only book that fits into this category. You're going to find Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah in the Old Testament that in many respects are much like Revelation because of the way they structure their information. Now, there are some differences, obviously. Daniel is split in two when you talk about the first 6 chapters being more historical in nature, and then you have the latter 6 chapters that are more apocalyptic in the way they present information. The same could be said for Ezekiel or Zechariah. But regardless, they all fit into the same category, generally speaking. They're all looked at generally the same. So Revelation is not on its own in the Bible, but it is somewhat on its own in the New Testament. It is unique. It's not like one of Paul's letters. It's not like the book of Acts. It's not like the Gospels. It is distinct, but it does have some fellows in the Old Testament, namely among Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah, and it's going to be no coincidence then that we're going to have to go back to those books to understand what Revelation is saying as well, because a lot of the imagery is going to be the same. Let's talk about dates. Dates for the book of Revelation. I'm normally not one in a conversation like this to really dwell that much on the dates that are proposed for a book or a letter, simply because in many cases it doesn't affect how we understand it. It might affect some of the context and some of the details about that, so it does have impact, but generally it's maybe not the most important consideration. Revelation is unique in that respect when we talk about the dating of it, because really there's 2 different dates that are proposed for this book, one that is earlier and one that is later, and it does impact how we interpret the book and its meaning. To really illustrate what I mean by this, let's talk about those 2 different proposals for the dates. So we've got the early date that's going to put the book in the time frame of Nero Caesar. So it's going to be between 64 and 69 AD during his reign. And if you know anything about Nero, you already know he was a persecutor, he was an evil man. He sought to destroy Christianity, much like other emperors would do later on, but he was one of the first that really started that. So it would fit in with what we've already talked about when we talk about persecution and that becoming a bit more widespread. So that does fit that part, but there's other details that are maybe missing from that. There is also the later date that puts the book between 81 and 96 AD, generally closer to the 96 mark, that would take place during the reign of Domitian Caesar. So he is another Roman emperor that comes much later, and he also was a persecutor. He was an evil man, a paranoid man also. I would encourage you to research him a little bit, and you can find out just the type of character you're dealing with in Domitian. But these are the two date proposals, and they both have a similar context. They do both have merit to them. They both have strengths and weaknesses. We're going to go with the later date, because there's a little bit more evidence that leans in that favor, mostly from church history and the understanding that some of the earliest disciples had. There were some by the 2nd century that explicitly said it was written during the time of Domitian Caesar, so we're going to lean toward that. But again, there is merit for both. But let me take a step back so we can illustrate why this matters, because I don't want to just say all this and then leave it at that. Why does this actually impact our understanding of Revelation? The earlier date would likely mean that we're interpreting the symbols and the imagery of the book in terms of the context of what happens in Jerusalem in AD 70, when the destruction of Jerusalem takes place. So the early date would put it as a book that's predicting that and the downfall of Judaism and the downfall of Jerusalem, whereas the later date is not really tied to the land of Israel. It's not really tied to Jerusalem or the temple or anything like that. It's more just about the church and what was taking place at the time. So that's why the dating here makes a bigger difference, because it does impact how some things are interpreted. But again, in this study, the way we're looking at this, it is going to be the later date. It's going to be the date that puts us between 81 and 96 AD during the reign of Domitian Caesar. And as we go through, we'll see some details that support that. We may not mention it explicitly every single time, but we'll have some more conversations as we go through. Let's talk about John. So we've talked a lot about the background of Revelation so far. We have a grip on its context. We've talked about the meaning of it. Let's talk about John as the writer of Revelation. So there's many Johns in the scripture, but this specific John in the New Testament is the Apostle John. And he was one of Jesus' closest disciples. In fact, he wrote a gospel and 3 other letters that confirmed his relationship with Jesus and his concern for the early church and his role in the early church for that matter. He was a man who was influential in the lives of so many people, and he himself was influenced by Jesus and what he did on this earth. He would record in the Gospel of John how he was the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was there with Jesus for a very long time. They had a very close friendship. They really were in a close-knit relationship. And so John is well positioned to write a gospel. He's well positioned to write 3 letters. He's well positioned to write the book of Revelation because of his role as an apostle and that closeness that he had with Jesus. So Jesus chooses John for the book of Revelation to unveil this information to make sure it gets communicated the right way. Now, John's situation was unfortunate when he wrote this book. He was exiled at this time. And what that means is that likely a provincial governor, someone who was obviously hostile to John, saw him as a threat, perhaps due to his preaching, perhaps due to his leadership in the church. That part is unclear, but we can say with confidence that he was not well liked by the Roman authorities. So he was exiled. And where he was exiled to was not a vacation resort. It was not a hotel. He was exiled to a place called Patmos. And if you look up the island of Patmos and you look at some pictures of it, you're going to find out pretty quickly it is not a place that anyone wants to be. It is a barren and volcanic island, a place that is generally uninhabitable, but here John is living and surviving on this island. And also keep in mind, he was not a spring chicken when this was taking place. He is an old man when this is happening. He's likely toward the end of his life, in fact. And he's living on an island in this condition, not being well taken care of, having to fend for himself in a lot of respects. And that is the place where he writes this book. It fits the context like we've been talking about, so it makes sense in that respect. But don't make any mistake about it. John was not in a comfortable position when he wrote this book. It seems like when he wrote his gospel and the 3 other letters that he was in a better position. But Revelation, he was not in a very good position. But nevertheless, despite his exile, despite the sufferings he was experiencing, he writes this book. He writes this book at the command of Jesus and the revelation of the Holy Spirit. And as writing this book would go, he is intending to encourage the Asian Christians. So we're going to see very quickly here in Revelation chapter 1 that this book would have been received by the seven churches of Asia Minor. So we're going to find out a lot about those seven churches and their condition, but they were the primary audience of this book to begin with. And remember what we talked about at the beginning, that persecution that was ongoing. It's going to become very evident that these churches were all deeply impacted by that persecution. There were some that had lost members. They had members who were put to death by the Roman authorities because of their association with Jesus. So they're facing tremendous hardship. They're having to make impossible decisions. And so John is tasked with writing this book that will encourage their hearts and remind them that although they have questions, although they aren't sure why this is happening, although they are discouraged to the utmost, that in the end, if they stay faithful, they will have the victory. God will vindicate them in the end, no matter what may happen. And that really distills the whole message of the book right there. That God wanted to make sure that the early Christians, the Asian Christians specifically, were not so discouraged that they would give up entirely, but that they remember that God is still in control, that he still understands what's taking place, and that he will avenge his servants, and that all they need to do is wait and put their trust in him and keep doing the things that he commands them to do and not lose sight of what is truly important. But as we go through Revelation and we begin digging into its pages, we have a lot more ground to cover to that end to see how God communicates that message and the deep meaning that it has, both to the Asian Christians in the first century and to us living in the 21st century. We're going to pause there, and we're going to pick up in our next conversation in the text of Revelation. So we've had 2 episodes to prepare us before we even get into the text, but I promise in our next episode we are going to get into the text of Revelation chapter 1. We're going to find out more about the introductory matters that John has to talk about in that first chapter, and then we're going to talk about Jesus and how he presents this message to the Apostle John so he can communicate it on to the 7 churches of Asia. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this. I hope it has enlightened you on the background of Revelation, and it will help set us up for success as we progress from here. Thank you.